hear about. No, so I'll just pass it over to you, and if you want to talk for 10 to 12 minutes to kind of introduce your work and how it speaks to some of the questions we have about democratic futures in the US after the inauguration today. Hopefully it happens.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I've been excited, but also a little worried, given the high degree of uncertainty and instability that we've been experiencing in the United States right now. So where would I even begin, and how quickly might new developments derail what I was going to say? So I've been working on a chapter for a book on gender and the 2020 elections that's supposed to be due on March 1st. And I had to put it on pause so I wouldn't have to keep rewriting the introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I had been writing in that chapter, as well as what I've been struggling with, because I think it gives you a kind of a good indication of some of the things that have been going on. But it also, I think it speaks a little bit to what my research is on. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my research, I write a lot about intersectionality, which focuses on how different systems of power and oppression interlock to shape our politics. In particular, I focus a lot on how gender and race intersect, applying a race-gendered analysis to social movements, political representation, and public policy. So this chapter that I've been writing is, like I said, is on a book on gender in the US in the 2020 US election. And the chapter focuses a lot on social movements and voting rights. And looks at that through a race-gendered lens. And I think that there's a lot in that I think is really pertaining to this particular political moment, but also our discussion here today about democratic futures. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have just a few slides just to kind of break up the monotony. So let me go ahead and make sure I can get that up here. All right, thumbs up. Can you all see that? All right, okay, great. So here we go. All right, so when I started writing the chapter, kind of the first emphasis or the kind of first argument that I was trying to make was that, social movements have played a really important role in US democracy. That if we look at US democracy and we really interrogate it right from the beginning, what the institutions are, who is included and who is excluded, we can really see that US democracy has always been partial and incomplete. And race and gendered movements have been a really important part of continuing democratization. And that democratization has never been finished because there has never been full inclusion in the way that it has theoretically meant to do. Right from the beginning with the US Constitution, who was allowed to participate in the democracy, who was allowed to vote, was limited to white men of means. And it took some changes, some social movements, placing pressure to change some of those institutions to further democratize them. So if you look at the US Constitution, a lot of the additions in terms of who's allowed to include happen later. So the 15th Amendment in 1870 is when African Americans are allowed to the right to vote, and where racial equality in voting gets added later. And even though it's added formally at that moment, it isn't in practice. The 19th Amendment, right? We've been celebrating here in the United States the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, when women are added to the Constitution and given the right to vote, at least theoretically. But then, even then, it's white women who are given the right to vote, that in practice, women of color, many women of color, African Americans, but also Mexican Americans, indigenous tribes had various different arrangements. A lot of them are still precluded, if not formally by the laws, in practice. And so we have the Jim Crow South, in which African Americans are still prohibited from exercising the right to vote. Less discussed is what was happening in the Southwest, in which there were similar Jim Crow policies aimed towards Mexican Americans. And so in effect, a lot of people weren't able to exercise that right to vote. And we don't see that changing in the Constitution and with laws, legislation, until after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And so we have the 24th Amendment, and we have the elimination of poll taxes in 1964. Voting Rights Act, which is really, in effect, a big democratizing moment for people of color to be added and being allowed to vote. And so even then, when we see these kind of formal changes being happened, we still see voter suppression going into the 21st century. And in fact, we see an uptick in it in the 2000s. That, in the 2000s, we have kind of an election that gets a lot of attention that ends up going to the Supreme Court. And it hinges on Florida, and Florida being a place where voter suppression has been pretty rampant and continues to be a challenge today. And so, in the 2000s, we start seeing a wave of legislation being passed, making it harder for people to vote, making it harder for people, and often having a disproportionate impact on people of color and able to do that. These efforts gained steam after the election of Barack Obama. So after 2008, when he brings together a multiracial coalition in order to win, Republicans start mounting an effort at the state level to take over state legislatures. And a big part of what happens at that time, starting in 2010, is they start passing restrictive voting laws that make it harder in practice for people to participate. And so we start seeing voter purges, we start seeing voter identification laws put into place. We start seeing a shift in the rhetoric and emphasis on voter fraud, and voting is not a right, it's a privilege. We see the closing of polls that are occurring. And this all gets further aggravated in 2013 when the Supreme Court undoes a significant part of the Voting Rights Act, a part that makes states that have a long history of voter suppression approve new laws ahead of time, gets struck out. And so states were able to put in restrictive policies that had been caught up in the courts immediately and place the burden of proof on voters to kind of prove that they've been disenfranchised in unfair ways, making it a pretty high bar in order to overthrow some of those policies. So at the same time, bringing back the social movements into that, the movements that were an important part of getting some of the laws changed also become an important part of mitigating some of this voter suppression that's going on. And race-gendered mobilization is an important part of this. So it isn't just, it isn't groups, even though a lot of these disenfranchisements are happening to voters of color, we see that a lot of community organizations are the ones that are kind of leading the battle on this front. So some states that have some of the most restrictive policies also have high degrees of mobilization in the community, making sure people know how to navigate some of the restrictions that have been put into place. That they make sure people are registered, that they're speaking with their communities to get out the vote. And women of color have been a big part of this mobilization. And so in the United States, there's been a lot of attention given, rightly so, to Stacey Abrams. But her mobilization in Georgia is emblematic of some of the mobilization that's been happening in communities across the United States. And often those community organizations have leadership of women of color who are doing that. So race-gendered movements have been a big part of getting out the vote. They were in this election, they have been in past elections. They're likely to be an important part moving forward, making sure that people know how to vote, how to get registered. Because in the States, it varies but from state to state. I live in Colorado, where it's actually fairly easy to vote, that there's a lot of efforts put into place that make it tremendously easy. We have mail-in ballots. During the pandemic, there's some additional obstacles, but Colorado, it was easy to navigate those. Still getting the information to people to how to do that is important, but in other states, the bars are really high to do that. And so that sort of mobilization is really essential for democracy to function. So another way of thinking about how social movements have an impact is that social movements provide an extra institutional mean of having your voice heard. And so, another part of the chapter, I'm kind of talking about like how that happens and how sometimes we see kind of a back and forth in the United States, right? With our two-party system, that we see switches in power from the left and to the right. And so it'd be really easy to kind of think about this as a situation that, we have seen in the past that, if Democrats win, then we see mobilization on the right. when we see the Republicans winning, we see resistance or mobilization happening on the left. And we see that in the last 20 years of American history. We do see a little bit of that back and forth. We see with the election of Barack Obama, we see the rise of the Tea Party and mobilization on that front. With the election of Trump, we see, the Women's March and the rise of the resistance, mobilization, progressive mobilization. That's been kind of a big part. Black Lives Matter movement had already been there, but we see kind of an increase happening within the last year. And so we can, it would be really easy to think of this in terms of kind of like a back and forth. The group that's left out of power exercises these extra institutional means as a means of exercising democracy and getting their voices heard. But it's also important to look at this through that lens of power in terms of what are these movements doing? What are the, why are they mobilizing? What sort of institutions are they feeling excluded from? And what sort of exclusionary practices are in place for that? And in this case, when we look through race gendered lens, like we can look the Tea Party, the research on the Tea Party looks and says that it was disproportionately white, it was disproportionately men, there were women included that were important leaders within it, but it still is kind of a white male dominated movement when we look at that. Now, when we look at the resistance, right, even from the beginning, when we looked at kind of the Women's March, we see a lot of white women, but it was more of a multiracial coalition. It kind of varied in different parts of the United States. But some of the leadership and some of the national organizations were very kind of intentionally inclusive after kind of a rough start. And so we have a multiracial coalition. We see the Black Lives Matter movement. We see the immigration. Oops, that's my normal alarm clock. We see the immigration rights mobilization. And so we see a very different composition of movements. And the mobilization, though, in terms of what they're aimed at, the resistance coming from the left is really aimed at trying to add people's voices to the democracy, people's voices that have often been disincluded, to fight for rights that have not been granted, that have been actually taken away. Whereas the mobilization that's coming from the right is upholding institutions that have enshrined rights for white people, for men, that uphold heteronormativity, right? And so one movement is pushing to expand democratization, whereas one movement is trying to uphold institutions, right? And uphold institutions that have actually been that impartial democratization, that have been undemocratic, that have been exclusionary in terms of that. And so it's important to remember power and how that power fits and how it structures those institutions, and then whether mobilizations are aimed at kind of sharing that power or continuing to restrict it for that. And so for that, having a critical lens is really important. And so in terms of, to kind of keep it short then and to wind up, the implications of the 2020 election on voting rights for the United States, that's kind of where I'm leaving, is what do we see moving forward? So some people, are definitely seeing this as a hopeful day, especially like from the left, right? That we see the end of the Trump presidency, which has definitely been one of restricting rights, not only of kind of upholding status quos, but actually undoing any advances that had been made towards inclusion. But at the same time, even though Democrats have gained a lot of power, what they do with that power is still a big question. And there is still a lot of work to happen within the Democratic Party in terms of building that inclusion for gender, for race, more broadly. And there are still some conservative elements within it. But also this election and the rhetoric around it, the rhetoric about stop the steal and voter fraud, is not new in the way that people would like to say that this is specifically a Trump movement. This has been how Republicans have been putting in place restrictive voting policies in a number of states, is that rhetoric of, voting is not a right, it's a privilege. They use the specter of voter fraud. And a lot of people have that message has resonated, and that really sets up the that the questions that have been called has really set the stage for more repressive policies. And so my big fear moving forward and what I'll be watching is to see how state legislatures, especially Republican state legislatures, use this moment, use the kind of rhetoric that's been surrounding the questions that have been surrounding this election to push forward with an agenda that had already been in place to really restrict the voting rights, particularly in ways that have impact on people of color, as well as other groups. When you look intersectionally, that there's, my research shows that there's a lot of other potential impacts that other groups that are impacted by these restrictive sorts of policies. And so, to what extent are we going to see that happen? And so, ultimately, I think that this, the importance of an intersectional lens to our study of democracy is, we really need to think more broadly to what extent are countries that are the countries we consider democracies truly democratic? Who is included within those democratic institutions and who is excluded? And then when we have social movements, are the social movements aimed at increasing inclusion for the groups that have been excluded? Are they focused on upholding or institutionalizing those exclusions? So those are kind of my early morning thoughts on what's been happening in the United States and where we might go moving forward.
Thanks so much, Celeste. I definitely learned a lot from that, and I quite appreciated the longevity of some of the exclusion movements up to now and the way that you pulled those threads together. So it was really useful, and I've plenty of questions, but it's not my turn right now, so I'll come back in a while. By the way, what's the book or the chapter that the book is part of, Celeste?
So it's a text that gets used a lot in gender politics classes. It's Gender and Elections, and it focuses on the U.S. Elections. And so this is the most recent edition, and I got asked to do a chapter on social movements. So I didn't realize how exciting it was going to be. Great,
and what I meant to say, we've got a link to your bio in the chat as well, so people can check out some more of your work there, and we'll do that for everyone. And I just wanted to say as well, because I forgot to say this at the start, if people want to ask questions, they can type them in the chat if they want one of us to, I can read them out later, or we'll have an opportunity after for people to put their hands up and ask questions themselves, obviously. Okay, so we're going to move on to Aaron next. So Aaron, floor is yours, and you can tell us about probably stuff about reactionary democracy and how it applies to the US, I guess.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. The storming of the Capitol by a mob of Trump supporters, including the Proud Boys, QAnon, Oath Keepers, and the unaffiliated, encouraged by Trump on the 6th January, caused shock and raised some questions. As arrests are being made, Trump is deplatformed and impeached. His enablers and apologists are retreating. And Inauguration Day is here. I want to look at some of the questions and claims that were made along the way or in response, particularly concerning what these events, as attacks, says about American democracy and racism. And that's past, present, and future. This can be seen in the ways in which the event has been referred to as a coup and un-American, and those involved as fascists and seditionists, and the ways in which American exceptionalism has been evoked and celebrated in response and as a defense, most notably by Joe Biden himself, to quote, "The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect the true America. This is not who we are. What we are seeing is a small number of extremists dedicated to lawlessness. This is not dissent. It borders on sedition. I am shocked and saddened that our nation, so long a beacon of light, hope, and democracy, has come to such a dark moment. And America is about honor, decency, respect, and tolerance. That is who we are. That is who we've always been. This image of America and claim this is not who we are flies in the face of its violent settler colonialism history, slavery, segregation, and continuing systemic racism and state violence. The latter even acknowledged in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests by, amongst others, Biden in his campaign, and comments on the different police responses to BLM, which saw a brutal crackdown and paramilitary preparedness, to those storming the Capitol who got restraint, access, and selfies. Although, of course, there was an armed response with one protester killed and a police officer killed by a mob. Ironically, on 18th January, Biden's American exceptionalism would get competition from Trump in the form of the 1776 report, which represented America as a nation founded on equality, untainted by racism, colonialism, and slavery. That's who we've always been, but under the threat from the left, anti-racists, and of course, academics. The notion that it was a small band of extremists is also problematic. While the numbers were small, and that needs to be acknowledged, their representation flies in the face of claims about the threat they pose to democracy itself, and the fact that they were encouraged, legitimized, emboldened, and mainstreamed by a democratically elected president who many more voted for, and was supported and enabled by the GOP, right-wing media, wider liberal media, and online platforms. As Aurélien Mondon and I argue in Reactionary Democracy and other publications we've done together and I've done on my own, this mainstreaming is predicated on a representation of Trump supporters in the media, academia, and politics, sympathetically and crucially incorrectly, as the white working class left behind, also known as the people and the demos, with legitimate grievances and in need of democratic representation. Many were also demanding and providing platforms for racists and the far right under the auspices of democratic balance, representing the Trump voter, and free speech. Of course, the mob at the Capitol were not socioeconomically left behind. They included a doctor, the son of a judge, a data scientist, real estate broker, Olympian, and police. That has not stopped calls for Biden to bring Trump supporters into the fold. It may even play a role in his promise to heal divisions, along with concerns about political polarization, where American inequality and divisions is between right and left, as opposed to class and race, gender, and more. Of course, the other side of the left behind argument is that Trump supporters' racism and far-right politics were class-based, as opposed to being about whiteness and reactionary politics that cut across class lines, but could be couched in a pseudo-sociological victim narrative and weaponized. If you accept the notion that the Trump voter voted for a president who ran on a racist platform, enacted racist policies, emboldened the far right, it makes one wonder how Biden could construct an equivalence between both sides and heal divisions while addressing systemic racism, as he promised. It is now trickier with the Capitol attack. Perhaps that is one of the reasons for representing those involved as a small group of extremists. It is, of course, important to recognize the small numbers to avoid amplifying the threat or feeding the self-mythologization of those involved. But it needs to be done without exceptionalizing them to the point that they are rendered so far beyond the boundaries of American history, democracy, and mainstream that our ability to analyze and challenge that relationship and the construction of American exceptionalism, which facilitates this, is lost. Now, we deny the current status and longer history of the American far right, particularly when it achieved mass support and mainstream access, or even has attacked the state before. Where is the Klan at Birth of a Nation or the Civil Rights era? What about when in 1926, 25,000 Klansmen marched to the Capitol, or in 1939 when the German-American Bund held a rally with over 20,000 at Madison Square Garden? There's also the Oklahoma City bombing, an attack on another federal building that was part and parcel of a wider anti-government movement. No mention of Charlottesville or the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer in October. Surely these establish a pattern that should be enough, if not to acknowledge as part of American history, at least secure the Capitol a bit. Yet acknowledgement is not always enough. As we argue in Reactionary Democracy, the far right, as extremist, terrorist, or fascist, when recognized, has a well-established function in American political discourse, playing the role of the evil illiberal racist foil and distraction from our good liberal democratic societies and politics. This often requires a tricky move of simultaneously diminishing and amplifying its meaning and significance, but always displacing it, whether onto history, the fringes, individuals, or foreigners. We saw Biden do this during the campaign launch. To quote, in Charlottesville, we saw Klansmen, white supremacists, neo-Nazis come out in the open, their crazed faces illuminated by torches, veins bulging, and bearing the fangs of racism. The fangs of racism obviously being very distinct from systemic racism, chanting the same anti-Semitic bile heard across Europe in the 30s, and they were met by a courageous group of Americans, and a violent clash ensued, and a brave woman lost her life. Thus Biden renders the far right foreign and opposition to it American, before stating it was Trump's response that there were some very fine people on both sides that sealed the deal to run. It is interesting that, like Biden, Nazi-occupied Europe is evoked both in the 1776 report, where Trump sort of, and Trump supporters displace it onto Europe only, and the only is key. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, who gave Kristallnacht as a point of reference, and not the history of American fascism. This would include notably the 1930s, which led to the government's anti-fascist Brown Scare that targeted foreigners in a period that also saw the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, had Biden or Schwarzenegger recognized this, or the prevalence and history of racist mob violence, such as in the form of lynching, it would render the American dream a nightmare and not allow for a celebration of democracy against Trumpism. We also see this in coups, or the term coup that's being used, which are seen as not only atypical of America, but typical of the global South, as demonstrated by the shock and term banana republic. This occurs with no recognition of Americans' historical role in such a coups and the racism of this. And it's not as if sedition is not thrown around by the right against the left all the time, and the far right to mythologize itself, their revolutionary ancestors, and the Confederacy. We also saw the displacement function of the far right for centrists in arguments that as a centrist liberal who could appeal to Trump supporters, or the left behind, Biden was best positioned to defeat white supremacy and fascism. Biden's calling on Trump to denounce white supremacy and the Proud Boys, and his refusal and call for them to stand down and stand by consolidated this construction. In 2018, Hillary Clinton gave an interview with, was published in The Guardian, affirmed this logic, arguing Europe needs to curb immigration to stop right-wing populists, thereby legitimizing their ideas and accepting their supporters. Such statements and calculations also raise the question of what they are against when they oppose racists in the far right. Is it only the more overt, illiberal racism, extremism, and violence? That may be why the storming of the Capitol for Trumpism, it took the storming of the Capitol for Trumpism to truly cross the line, and not Trump's Muslim ban, deportations, the separation of parents and children by state agencies. Unless the issue was always protecting American institutions and not those at the sharp end of racism, inequality, and injustice. Now, that's not to say there's not a significant difference between Trump and Biden-Harris or Clinton, particularly for those at the sharp end. But what are they fighting for if anything is better than Trump and they want his supporters? This doesn't mean not celebrating their election and Trump's defeat or expressing horror at the storming of the Capitol. Despite that horror, it doesn't mean we should accept the label fascism, extremist, terrorist, coup uncritically in ways that make centrists look like saviors or America too exceptional for these. The use of such labels or terms may be unhelpful if they are merely used to exceptionalize or are inaccurate, or they embolden the far right. They may be helpful if, in addition to using them to capture the nature of actors and events, or in the case of fascism, a political ideology and formation, hotly debated, the link to enablers and collaborators is also established. This is important to highlight those who got us there and those who may still be in positions entrusted to deal with the fallout. This includes law enforcement, particularly because the threat of fascism and a coup and Trumpism itself was always control of the state, its institution, and agencies as well. That is why it is not only the different responses to the Capitol mob and Black Lives Matter that are of significance, but the similarities. In both cases, the police were aligned with and enabling the far right in defense of Trumpism and the system, and Trump emboldened and incited both, with the far right supporting the police at Black Lives Matter protests, again with the selfies, organizing against Black Lives Matter in support of blue and white lives, including that of Darren Wilson, who killed Michael Brown, recruiting from and attempting to infiltrate the police and military, some of who stormed the Capitol. I don't know what, if any, form Trumpism will take next. But we do know that systemic and state racism and violence, which underpin such alignments and underpin Trumpism, predate Trump undermine American democracy and will remain after the arrests, impeachment, and inauguration. And there is no guarantee Biden and Harris will address these in a context where fascism and an attempted coup serve as a distraction. Nor if they think police reform is all that is needed, or rush to strengthen or enact new counterterrorism and counter-extremism programs. Particularly if, as COINTELPRO did in the 1950s and 60s, and Trump has set up the security apparatus to do recently, it suppresses the very anti-racist and anti-fascist activists who have been on the front line and warning about this. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Aaron. It was again really informative. Helped me appreciate some of the lack of recognition of some of the problems of the exceptionism that comes out in some of the rhetoric. Actually, just as an aside, probably my favorite bit of dark humor over the last couple of weeks was, I think the joke was the US, due to international travel, the US had to organize its coups at home this year. But
Absolutely.
yeah, I'll move on to Will now, who's going to probably tell us something about trust, and people can get their Q&A ready. I think there's a couple of questions already popping up, but Will, you have the floor now.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So I think today, obviously, I kind of feel like I want to be, kind of seeing what every little moment of what's happening in America right now, the kind of the not so peaceful transition of power. And Matt, you sent me 3 questions. I'm going to speak to a little bit. And I'll frame perhaps what's going on in America today in a kind of broader context before focusing in on some particular aspects of it. I mean, I think there's this broad question that we're living through a crisis of trust, that, kind of that trust is an all-time low. I was on a webinar the other day with the OECD Secretary General, who was saying that we're kind of talking about a crisis of trust. UN Secretary General has talked about kind of growing distrust as being one of the 4 horsemen of global challenges facing the world. And Trumpism, I think, needs to be kind of placed in that context of this kind of this feeling. I think it is a feeling of existential angst around democratic politics. But it's also important to remember that if you look back over much of the post-war period, we go through periodic crises of democracy and political trust. That if you look at almost in every decade, whether it's the 70s, kind of Nixon or so forth, or economic crisis, there are these moments in which we feel democracy and democratic systems are in crisis, whether you go to the 80s, the 90s, or 2000 and so forth. And I think there is actually mixed evidence on this question of whether we're an all-time low in terms of the ebb of satisfaction with democracy. Certainly, work that's been done by colleagues like Victor Valgartson and Dan Devine suggests that actually, that consistent with the work of others, that democratic satisfaction is not necessarily declined globally to the extent that we might think. But it does seem that trust in parties and parliaments and legislatures does seem to be in systematic decline. And almost, I think it's worth rather the start at the end with Trump, the start at the beginning, that his election in 2016 did seem to reflect an authoritarian impulse. Various studies have shown that whether racism and misogyny were dominant predictors of the Trump vote, which is why actually the arguments around economic left-behindedness are sort of being pushed to the side. Although I think they shouldn't be entirely pushed to the side, in the sense that a lot of, I think, what we're trying to understand in terms of the trends impacting democratic polities, and not just about cultural shifts, but around cultural shifts in the context of long-term shifts in social economic structure. We then just wrap up into culture, and actually, when we're looking at long-term structural changes over 40, 50 years in our domestic and global models. Trump's election was interlinked with this distrust of the metropolitan elite. And one of the fascinating dissonances through the whole process, the whole kind of Trump presidency, has been the story that was told about elites in Washington versus what Trump stood for. And today you saw that he reversed an executive order that he passed on taking into office on restriction of lobbying. So kind of the swamp had been drained, but only for us, for them and not us. And I think that's one of the great difficulties that we have as analysts, understanding and differentiating between the rhetoric of populism versus the reality. And I think it's why we need to be really careful with not to swallow whole the rhetoric of these sorts of periods. In the context of trust, I think it's really important to identify more globally, and I'll speak globally, partly because I'm not a kind of an expert solely in American politics or at all in American politics, but having studied over the years, I think there's a really interesting distinction between the core periphery divide in political trust. In the US, much like the UK, the sense of distrust and dislike of metropolitan elites is very much a kind of a small town rural America. We saw that in the presidential election. The voting patterns were such that the suburbs and urban centers swung towards Biden increasingly, whereas actually Trump's vote held up in a small town red America. And there's a geographical polarization that Jerry Stoke and I have written about in the UK. But actually, if you go to look to other countries, and take kind of a country like China, which first of all has higher political trust than we might expect in advanced democracies, but actually where the pattern of the geographical pattern of trust seems to be reversed. That actually trust is higher in the polity in rural small town areas and kind of peripheral areas, and lower among professional creative classes in urban centers. And so I think in a very Western view of political trust, the kind of a view dominated by people like Trump, we forget that actually the global dynamics of democratic trust and satisfaction are quite different. So I think the kind of the part two of my three-part talk is really, well, does this departure of Trump herald the end of the crisis of political trust? Just as we might ask, does Brexit signal the new sunlit uplands of British democratic politics? Right? Is this a moment that I think, as kind of Aaron was kind of suggesting, is this a moment of trust is going to be rebuilt in American politics? And I think the simple answer, I think, is this going to be, has Trump either been a tonic to the US polity? Has he done what he said he would do and rebuild faith of the US public, or has his kind of been cast out, provided a cathartic moment? I think in either instance the answer is no. And I think I'll just say a few comments on US politics, but then relate them more broadly to other democratic systems. I think polarization in the US has been a topic of increasing interest for scholars over recent decades, and it is clearly a problem for US politics. And I think polarization is used overly easily as a term when sometimes we're talking about asymmetric polarization. I think that's one thing that's really important to recognize when we all think we're playing the same political game, when actually in politics one side may not be playing the same game. And I think that is one lens that as analysts we, and certainly media, struggle with, the idea that politics is a game that both sides play by the same rules, but is not clearly the case. And so it's easy to kind of throw all of US politics as a kind of the diagnosis of the ills of US politics into the kind of polarization basket. But I think we first of all have to talk about asymmetric polarization, but it's certainly a warning of what can happen to advanced democracies if they do not take their health seriously. I think on one level, it's easy to say, well, US politics has always had these sorts of problems and these tendencies, but it certainly is the case that it is severely deepened in terms of the crisis of democratic politics in the US in recent decades. But I think it's also important to say that it's not just polarization, it's about the wider systematic kind of arrangements of misinformation ecosystems, and QAnon, I think, is a great example of how conspiratorial thinking this is not just polarization. This is, I think we could have a debate as to the extent to which this is prevalent in wider society, but is a really significant issue, which is a dangerous moment that will not simply be reversed. And it kind of highlights the problem in advanced technological societies where information is freely available as a marketplace of kind of highly unregulated, at the speed with which mass belief systems can be disrupted and really kind of poisoned with completely, I think, it's sort of deeply disturbing to read some of the reports of the people who are charged with kind of storming the Capitol, not because of what they did, because in many ways they were caught up in the moment. Many of them were not really what you kind of frame as some of them were pretty dangerous people, but others were, what you would just say people who were caught up in the moment. But actually what's dangerous is the information ecosystem in which they lived that made them believe things that were palpably not true. They weren't just partisan motivated reasoning in the sense that, those among us might have a different view of how the economy is going, or we might assign that to, different partisan perceptions. But these are people who are living in a fundamentally different reality. And that raises huge questions. It matters for public policy. We see that it matters in the work that we've been doing in our TrustGov project in terms of vaccine hesitancy and lockdown skepticism. Obviously in the US, it's sort of kind of linked to kind of mask wearing, you know, and when you have these sorts of information ecosystems, how do you shift behavior? How do you govern in a context in which those sorts of subcultures and sub-information systems exist? And so there's a real slow poison being administered to the roots of democratic politics that clearly, you know, a Biden administration is not going to suddenly fix. And I think the kind of the whole debate around the Twitter cancelling of Donald Trump sort of highlights the problem that you in some senses cannot win, that, you know, to try and shut down these debates as framed as kind of cancel culture or kind of over-regulation of civic life. But if you allow them to flourish, there is a really huge question of how far they go. And I think for UK and European politics, the question is, well, of course it couldn't happen here, right? It's just an American problem. America's a kind of it's, you know, kind of the words, I was thinking kind of Leonard Cohen's words of America as the kind of the cradle of the best and the worst. We always think of it as kind of the extremes of the democratic experiment, but I think it clearly signals that other democratic systems should be highly wary of highly unregulated information media systems and cultures that allow these sorts of beliefs to grow. And I think in those of us who study political behavior and electoral behavior, I think have too easily forgotten recently some of the kind of seminal observations of study of political behavior that elite cues matter. You know, obviously the kind of the stop the steal and Trump's rhetoric over the election highlighted just the extent to which elites can construct and kind of shape the beliefs of voters. And that really in some ways takes me right back to seminal work of people like Philip Converse, you know, that actually because I think in our contemporary culture, and I'm certainly someone who likes to talk about the kind of public opinion being rational and being responsive, but there nevertheless is a degree to which ideological belief systems have incoherences and are heavily influenced by elites. And I think we need in some senses to recommit ourselves to the study of the power of elite cues as part of information systems. And so some of the complacency that has been had about illiberal populism not being anti-democratic, I think really need to be revisited and reconsidered. So just a final couple of comments, because I always thought I was going to give the short talk and then rambled on. I mean, I think, you know, you kind of sent me the question of what should happen next and what do we need to be thinking about to secure democratic futures. I mean, I think COVID, I don't like this framing of COVID an opportunity. You know, COVID is an opportunity to rebuild democratic, you know, kind of cultures and society and heal all inequalities. I think a lot of this is sort of bullshit that's framed by people who are kind of overly idealistic. And as a cynic, I'm here to kind of nip that in the bud. I mean, I think we should see COVID as an ongoing crisis that is currently nationally focused, that is exposing various fault lines and is just revealing ourselves in greater clarity than we might otherwise see. But I think, and I think that will raise all sorts of societal questions about education, inequality, employment, and so forth. But I think it is also going to become a global coordination problem. That I think we're at the stage where we're still seeing COVID through a national lens of lockdowns, vaccines, and so forth. And I think one thing that hasn't been recognised, that, you know, global inequalities in health and the management of disease is going to become a matter for states to start coordinating and managing, because it is no good countries managing COVID if there are upsurges in various countries that are not affluent countries that cannot afford mass vaccination programs, and the spread of conspiratorial beliefs or cultures that are opposed to vaccination, I think are going to be suddenly really significant. And so in some senses, I think we're going to see a return to many of kind of quite traditional themes of democratic governance in the international order. So while I think it is too easy to see kind of frame COVID as an opportunity, it certainly is a moment when the state is there again needs to be a revisiting of what the state is for and how states interact with one another on the global stage.
Thanks so much, Will, and loads in that as well. I'm glad you brought up the information ecosystems, because the others touched on it as well, but I'm sure that's something we'll want to talk about in the Q&A. So I think we're going to stop recording now. So that's